Hello friends, Old Dad is back with my fourth tutorial on route creation in Train Simulator 2021. This outing we will begin to look at working with terrain data in the simulator and how to create your route running through the hills and valleys. This will be quite different from the previous videos where we were working with flat earth terrain. We will also do a short review on what we have already learned and look at a few new tools and applications in the program for working with the terrain. As usual, you see in the background some of the route that I am creating in Train Simulator that is a portion of the current CSX line from Nashville to Chattanooga, Tennessee. My route centers around Cowan, Tennessee and the Tracy City branch to Palmer, Tennessee. All of this in the United States of America. If you haven't learned how to import your terrain into the program for the area that you want to model or create, there's a link in my video description to an excellent tutorial on the Matt Plays TV YouTube channel that will tell you how to import the data files that you will need. You will use these files to create terrain in the program. It is essential to have that imported before you begin to create a route. So let's leave the video of my route now and open the Train Simulator program. And we're going to open up our Chattanooga tutorial route that we've created in the previous tutorials. So we click on Build, and then we click on Route, and the name of our tutorial route is Chattanooga. And we give it a second to load up, and here we are in our tutorial route. Let's review for just a moment how we lay track. First we go to the Toolbox, and in the Toolbox we click on the Linear Object Tools. Then we click on Main Track, Yard. And here we have the linear object cursor that we will adjust by left clicking and then rotating the mouse around, and you can turn this thing any direction you want it to be in. So I'm going to aim it in that direction, and then we're going to lay some track. Now remember that your straight or tangent track is always highlighted in yellow, and if you click on it, you lay a piece of track. Similarly, to do a curve, you put the Linear Objects tool down on the terrain, and then you just bend it in the radius, the direction that you want it to go in. Now we also talked about easements. It's another type of curved track in which the radius is specified and it carries out basically as far as you want to go. It maintains that radius when you use the Linear Object tool and easements. So those are the three basic types of track. To delete an object, you can click on it and highlight it. You can use the undo. And another thing that you can do is you can click and drag. And you see I generated a circle there, and it highlighted that object that's in that circle. If there were 5 objects in the circle, it would have highlighted all 5 of them, and then when I hit the delete button, they would have all been deleted. So this method, clicking and dragging and increasing a circle over the area that you want to delete something, is a method you can use, but you have to be very careful about accidentally clicking on that and then by some mistake accidentally deleting something that you didn't really intend to delete. Now here's a section of track that we're not going to keep in our little tutorial route, and I'm going to demonstrate the. Now if I just click that far, you see I've highlighted a segment of track here, and I can delete it. If I made the circle larger to encompass the area of the track that I want to keep, I could have potentially deleted that. So you've got to be careful using the click and drag method. Another thing that you have to be careful of when you're navigating through your route, that you accidentally click a piece of track and you should drag it out of position. Well, obviously, if I were in the middle of a large section of my railroad, let's click on this piece, and we'll drag it out of the way. Now I've interrupted the track that we've constructed. So that's where the undo key comes in. Got to be very careful that as you're casually moving across and navigating the route that you don't accidentally delete something that you intended to keep. Now let's talk a little bit about terrain. In the toolbox we have painting tools. If we click on that icon, we then see a new group of icons that show up that buttons that we can push to use different tools. Briefly, across the top here we have copy and paste, which are typical things that you would do if you had an object and you wanted to copy it. You could copy that object and then paste it in a new location as many times as you wanted to click the paste, just like any other program that you use a copy and paste. This display icon has to do with a bunch of symbols and things that will show up in the route the more you get created, and whether you wanted these items to appear or not. You turn them on and off using these check boxes, and we'll learn more about that as we roll along and actually get into creating a route. Then we have a delete trash can. We have a measuring tool which you can actually measure a distance. We'll highlight it and then it will tell you down here in the information bar 18.34 meters in that case, how long of a measurement you've actually made, 35.49 meters. So you can measure the length of something with that tool. I don't use that tool very often. Then we have the undo and the redo buttons, where you can undo an action you've taken or redo it if you decided that you want to keep that action. Okay, so let's now talk about the next row of tools, which are height, increase height, decrease height, smooth, level, noise, and snap. I'm going to demonstrate what these tools do, and I will say from the outset that I rarely ever use the noise. So let's look at height. If we take height and we set a brush size of 20, when I click on it you see there's the hash marks of the area that it's going to create with 20, and I can pull that and I can make a peak come up. I can make a depression by going the opposite direction. I'm increasing or decreasing the height of the terrain based on the size of the brush, which in this case is 20. If I make that 500, look at the size of my brush now. Oops. That was 50, not 500. So there's the size of my brush is 500. Now look what happens when I increase or decrease the size of the height. I can actually begin to create mountains and hills. And you can change the size if you want a different size. Terrain to appear. Sort of some foothills here. Okay. Now another thing you can do is you can use the increase height tool, and that tool, when you click it, it automatically begins to raise it if you want to make small adjustments. Let me pull in here and show you. We can change the speed down here also that we're operating at. that's a 1. We'll change it to 5, and you'll see that we get a much greater increase. And you can move this around and sort of blend it in as needed. You can use the decrease height tool to do the same thing. Okay, that's all very much trial and error, and you adjust the size that you want it to be, and you can create hills and valleys. You can create streams. Let's change this down to, say, 50, and we'll just bring it across right here. And you can see I'm depressing the scenery now. Now, I'm going to lay a piece of track down between my valley. In between. The railroad would try and take the easiest route through any given terrain. So if I take my linear objects tool, and I'm going to turn off easements, and we're going to go straight into the valley across that ravine, and then we're going to kind of turn it. Now look, some of the track is actually covered by some of the terrain. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the snap tool, and we're going to set a brush size of 50, and we're going to come through here and we're going to make a cut through here. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to make it a more narrow cut. We'll set it to 20. So you see, using the tools, I've actually laid the track right through my mountain structure that I created. And there are other tools like the smooth and the level that you can use to reduce the sharpness of the adjacent track that you've, or scenery that you've created, I should say, scenery, not track. So you begin to use these tools and find out how to create scenery. Now, as I said before, there's where we would put a bridge in, because I made a depression for a stream. As I said before, if you're going to do strictly a fictional route, this is what you would do. You could create your own scenery. You set up a world that comes from your creativity. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to create the scenery that goes with Chattanooga. So I'm going to undo everything I've done here, and we're going to eliminate all this stuff we've created here. I hope we can go back far enough and get rid of all of it. Alright, it would not let me get rid of all of it. So now I'm going to smooth it all out. You have a limited number of undos that you can do, but I'm going to take the leveling tool and I'm going to set it to 500. And if I start off over here in an area that's already at terrain level, I should be able to level through all of that and make it level right out where it was before. Okay. So here we are, we're back at the point that we started in Chattanooga. Now what we're going to do is we're going to import the terrain. As I told you before in my previous tutorial, the most prominent feature of Chattanooga is Lookout Mountain. And Lookout Mountain should be in this area right here. It's a very large, famous mountain in the city of Chattanooga. So now what we're going to do is we're going to import terrain, and when I do, it's actually going to raise the level of the terrain up to what the height above sea level it is in Chattanooga, plus all the surrounding elevations will be displayed as the mountains and hills and valleys all begin to appear. So when you import your terrain, it will mimic the real world elevations provided by the DEM files. So the next row of buttons here in our toolbox includes Paint Terrain and Import. We're going to import, and I'm going to select my source folder, which is the DEM SRTM folder, and I'm going to select 19 by 19. And I am going to import the terrain DEM. Now when I click this, it's going to take it a few seconds as it generates the terrain, and you will see that the area that we have been working out of, the track's going to stay there, and our little icon starting point is going to stay there, but the real world terrain is going to be generated at the elevations that it actually is. So here we are. The terrain level has now gone up to actual height in Chattanooga, and we're going to go up now and see what we have developed. By clicking the control, the up arrow, and the shift key, we quickly are up. Now here you have Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And then all around us we have ridges, Missionary Ridge. Then in the distance we have Signal Mountain, Walden's Ridge, Elder Mountain. But we're still in basically the same location we were when we created our route. So I'm going to go back down. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to hit Control G and bring Google Earth. Google Earth should be appearing up above us on the terrain, and it is. So now I'm going to raise the starting point up and bring it up with us to where it will be at the right height. So now we have our starting point up in Google Earth where it's supposed to be. Okay, here we are back down at the level that we were at before we created our terrain, and we no longer need this track, so I've highlighted it in red. I'm going to delete it. Now we've left nothing underneath the route that there's nothing that remains of our original tutorial route that we created. We are now going to work strictly in the real world with actual terrain. So you can see I'm back to Google Earth. I have my start point here, and we will be using that starting point to begin to lay the track in our world that we have now created with terrain. Okay, so now we're going to take a minute to talk about setting grades. Let's move over here somewhere into the distance, and we're going to now look at setting some grades. We'll go over to the track, and we'll see that right now I've got this set at 0.1%. And we're going to start laying a piece of track. I'm going to turn off Google Overlay for this. For the time being, and we're going to take our linear objects tool and we're going to just run some straight track out into the distance here. I don't intend to keep any of this, so I'm just picking a spot anywhere. So if we start out and we run along here and I lay down some track, you'll see that we're moving along. I could follow the network here while we're doing this, but I'm not. I'm going to, all right, now notice that as I lay the track, it starts to disappear under the scenery. That's because the undulating terrain, even though I'm inclining on a grade, I'm still passing through some of the scenery. So I'm gonna take it to there and stop it. And just like before, when we created a fictional terrain, we're going to use the snap tool to make the terrain snap to the level of the track. So in some places it's going to raise the terrain, and in other places it's going to make the terrain go down. You see, now we have that continuous piece of track, and we've adjusted the terrain so that we now have some little cuts, some little embankments here beside the track. Alright, you have to create all of this using your brush fall off and the angle of your embankments and the angle of your cuts. So let's undo all of that for the moment, and we go back to our first piece of track, which we laid at 0.1. Alright, now we're going to change that to 0.5, which is 0.5%. And we're going to lay the track again. We snap in to the end of our current piece of track, and we're going to lay some more straight. Now we laid a piece of straight at 0.5. Now let's go up to 0.75. We laid another piece of track, which we'll see in the end is all increasing to go up in height. Now just because you see area under here, that's not necessary. That could be the terrain that's making that opening underneath. But I'm going to now increase it to 1.75, just so you can see how the terrain changes. That's 500 meters out there. Now let's go back to the beginning, and as we get down to where we can look and see, you'll see these elevations change. I'm going to use the snap tool, and I'm going to make, oops, I just made a boo-boo there, you see. Accidentally, I moved the track. I'm going to hit the undo. I was telling you about that before. Sometimes you'll make a mistake, and the undo is critical. Let's go to snap. And we're going to start here, and we're going to get the terrain to follow the grade that I've established. Now you see there's no gaps underneath, and we're making cuts through the terrain, and we're bringing the terrain up to the level that it ought to be. We've got now quite a fill across through here. You see I'm bringing up a fill all along and under the track. Now this is not prototypical for the location that I'm creating, but this is all for demonstration purposes. So we go back to the beginning again, and let's follow our track. And we'll actually be able to see the changes in these when they get more abrupt. But you can see out in the distance that there's grade. Here's a grade change. Here's a more substantial grade change coming up. And the way you can tell that is to eyeball it at rail height. you can see the rather abrupt changes. Perhaps you've seen this in Train Simulator where they haven't done a smooth transition. There's a transition right there. And then we go farther, and the farther we go, where we changed it to a much higher grade percentage, you can really see the grade pick up in front of us down there. So that's all uphill. You can see what a difference this is. That's quite an incline. But it's not unprototypical. Railroads often had 1.5% and 2% grades, and sometimes greater than that if it was a branch line. Main lines, typically, they try to keep the gradients down where there is less of a chance of not being able to pull the mountain grade. But you see how I use the snap tool to pull the terrain up to where you are. As we go further along, we'll talk more about getting these gradients set and how you set that gradient. So I just wanted to demonstrate you a little bit about the gradients and how the elevation tool is used, the gradient tool is used. Now we're going to undo all of our good work here, go back to where we were. Bump, 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 bump. See, everything that I did there, I've completely returned it to the way that the terrain was created in the program. So, now if you're going to do a downgrade, I need to mention this also. You come over here and you put a minus in front of that. So that's a descending grade when it has a minus in front of it. So now we're going to work with the terrain in order to get ready to start laying some track. And we'll get Google open again, Google Overlay. And there are two ways that we can lay track. One way is if you have the profile chart available for the area that you want to create a route in. And this is the profile chart for the Craven's Yard area, and it gives us some useful information that we could use: the curvature, the gradients, the elevations, that the gradients change, and what the actual track layout was when this profile chart was developed in 1916. But if you don't have that available to you, we have to use the elevations that are available in Google Earth. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to start out here and we're going to look at this and we're going to determine how to lay track using only the elevations available in Google Earth. So as I look at Google Earth, the actual Google Earth, we pull over here and we look at the area that is our starting point right in here, and we see that down here in the toolbar we're given the elevations where the cursor is at the moment. So if I run my cursor along the track, you see we're about 664 feet, 663, 665, go the other direction, 664, 665. So as we look at this and we see the elevations that Google Earth is giving us, let's pull up the old profile chart and just see in the general area where we were, which is around the 149 mile post, we see that the elevations are right in the very general vicinity in Google Earth that they were back in 1916. There's 665. On around the curve it gets up to 667, 666, and so we see that the elevations in Google Earth are fairly close to what the actual elevations that the railroad took back in 1916 are. So as we go along here, and run our cursor over it, you can see this is fairly level. It's a fairly water level route because we're right next to the Tennessee River. So the gradients are fairly gentle along the river. It's staying a fairly consistent 665. Now here we've gone up to about 666. Sometimes, as I've mentioned before, in Google Earth it's a little difficult when you're at the base of a steep mountain or a hill to get an accurate measurement. Still maintaining about 665. There's 666 again. In this cut, we may not get a very accurate measurement. So we'll come outside of that. It's not going to change dramatically over a short distance. So we're down to 663 here. Looks like we're on a bit of a descending grade from 665. Now we're back to 665, 666 again. So using this method, we're going to have to kind of pick an average of what we'd like the grade to be over a given area. And what we're going to do is where we see a gradient change that we need to make, we're going to put a marker down so that as we're creating the roadbed or the grade for the track to be laid upon and there is a change in the gradient, we'll have a marker so we know where to start making that change. So let's go back into the train simulator program, and we're going to choose a marker to use where we want to make a grade change. We'll go up into our toolbox and we're going to click on the Objects tool, and then we're going to click on Miscellaneous. And in this case, my marker is not in here yet. I've got to import it. The marker that I like to use comes from the Stevens Pass route. So if I click on the Import or Object Set filter, and I come over here and this little flyout comes out, and I go down and I click GNTX, which is the Stevens Pass route, and I click on that and get the little check boxes checked. And then when you go and look, we see that there's now some new material to use here in the Objects box, and the marker that I like to use is A marker 01. And as we look at this marker, you'll see why. It's a nice tall pen, and you can adjust it up or down as you need to, and it becomes a good marker to use to set a point that you want to make some kind of change. Sometimes I'll use a setup like this where I know that I'm going to put a bridge, 4 points. Or I will put a point here and a point here to indicate that there will be a crossing at a later time. Sometimes I'll use it to indicate where the mile markers will go eventually, and I'll put a series of them together to indicate to me that that's a mile marker. These are all just little tricks I use. You don't have to use them, but it's just a method of keeping track of what's going on as you construct your route. And you can kind of create your own little code in your head about how you would use a marker. So anyway, we now have a marker picked out, and if we go back to Google Earth, we will find where we need to put a marker down to indicate a change in the gradient. So as we come around here and we start looking at the Again, we're looking at the elevation given in the information bar at the bottom. Our starting point, we're around 664. And as we roll along, we drop down to 663 for just a brief moment. So we see right there we change from 663 back to 664, 665. So we're going to put a pin down there to indicate that we have a slight change. Right about the start of the curve. Look again in Google Earth. We'll see how it holds. It looks like it's holding about 665 up to 666, 665. You've got to kind of average it out. You can't make a change at every little spot that it changes down through there when you're using this method. So somewhere about right here, looks like we're changing to about 666. I don't know, it's still kind of holding 665. I think we'll leave it the same. Still looking at 665 or so. You get into a cut area like this, it gets a little difficult to get an accurate measurement. So you've got to kind of average it out. 665, 666. Now here it appears we start to descend just a little bit. So I'm going to call about the end of this curve right here, we're going to change down. So we'll go into the program again and we will move over and put a marker down. So I'm going to add another marker about right here. Back to the Google Earth. Looks like we kind of hold that 663 for a short distance. Then here we're back sort of up to 665 again. 664 again. As I say, these measurements, you've got to kind of average them out. So at the end of this straightaway, it sort of changes again. We'll add another marker. Now here's where it crosses Lookout Creek. Let's go back into Google Earth and see where we're at. Still holding about 665 there. Now once we cross the creek, still holding about the same grade. Now I start to see some different numbers around this curve. We're sort of ascending for a bit. So after we go under this underpass at the Norfolk Southern Railway, it appears that we start up, so we're going to add another marker. And that's all the markers I'm going to put out for the moment. Let's fly back over to our starting point. So, we were calling this area right here, according to Google Earth, about 663, as I recall. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set the elevation and start to make some roadbed. To do that, we're going to use our feet to meters in Google Earth. We're going to say 663. Gives us 202.08. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to go into my painting tools, and I'm going to click on the level tool, and you see here we have a box down here in the settings for the brush and the leveling tool, a little tick radio box here that we can tick that is the actual elevation. We're going to set the height of the terrain using the leveling tool. Our measurement was 202.08. I'm going to set that to 202.08. Now, when I come over here and I use my brush, I'm going to run over the track area. Oops, I need to change the size of the brush down to about 25. And we're going to set that elevation, not 250, I said 25. Let's click the undo a couple of times there and get us back a little more the way we should be. Alright, no, so we're going to set the 663. As you can see, the terrain begins to adjust itself under the brush. Let's turn off Google Overlay just for a moment so you can see it happening. You can see the terrain beginning to adjust itself. Now I'm going to aim towards that marker. I'll turn the Google Overlay back on so that I know I'm on the track area. Notice the terrain is now going down. So around the area of this marker, we want to change to the next grade, which we'll say is 664, or 202.38. And now when we click on the terrain in that little area there, we're going to change it to that level. And I continue to follow the track around through there for a short distance. And then we go to 665, which is what we're going to carry it out around the front of the Lookout Mountain, 20269. Now you notice over here there's a large depression where the topography doesn't actually match what's there. And there's also a depression where there's a creek, but we're just going to move right along as if the creek doesn't exist in our mind for the moment. We're going to come back and we'll make a depression for the creek at a later time. You can see we're building sort of a fill along here. But we're going to carry this out now. Now that I'm getting close to the mountain, I'm also going to increase my brush size because I want there to be somewhat of a rock outcropping there. Notice that we're making some pretty dramatic change, but that's because the program's ability to discern the elevation of the track is not that precise. So that's why you get this gentle sloping down to the river edge. But in reality, this is a rock face around here. And that rock face was chipped away when they actually built the railroad. So we have to sort of come and create this. If we really get serious about it, this is all flat over here. And I can use the tool out here to go ahead and make this somewhat flat leading over to the interstate and to the river. I'm still set at 202.69, which is 665 feet above sea level. Now we'll be coming back and making some changes to what would be the rock outcropping when we actually do scenery. But we want to ensure that we have enough area outlined here for the track to be at the correct height. And when you're doing this, you'll see sort of a choppy or a ragged edge sometimes. That's where you've got to come back with some of the smoothing tools and actually correct that at a later time. But you see we're making quite a difference, and that's actually very similar to the way it is in the front of that mountain. You want to go slow. Always remember you've got the undo button. And as long as you hold down your left mouse, this is all one operation. If I take my finger off and I go hit the undo, you'll see that I'm returning a large area to the same shape that it was when we started out. So you have to unclick on occasion. If you kept it held down the entire way in front of the mountain, what we would wind up with is we would wind up with an undo that changed everything in front of the entire mountain. So on occasion you need to just click your left mouse and let it start over so that you're not creating one operation that when you hit the undo will undo everything that you've done in the entire area. Again, I'm just following along where Google Earth says the tracks are located. Notice there's a huge cut there now. That is not correct. We're going to use a larger brush size here, and we're going to smooth all that out, because basically all this is level all the way to the Tennessee River where the interstate is located. There may be some slight deviation in it, but not much. And this would be the area of the river. The interstate and the railroad occupy a very narrow shelf between the river and the base of the mountain. I can also improve the Google overlay a little bit so that you can actually see the track in there a little better. The interstate may in some cases actually be a little higher, but when we come back and actually put the interstate in there, we would correct that with the elevations the same way we're doing the track right off Google Earth. Now we'll be coming up on where one of our marker pins is before long. If you don't get the terrain back far enough, you'll have a piece of terrain sticking out right where you're going to lay your track. This is becoming a little bit of a cut right here, so I'm going to make the brush size just a tad smaller. We're actually going under the Norfolk Southern there. As we look back, we see we have sort of a shelf that runs all along the front of Lookout Mountain now. May not have made it wide enough for the interstate the entire way, but we'll come back and deal with that if we were going to complete the route as we go along. So I see my marker around the corner that I will be using to change elevations again, and this was going down, if you recall. So right in this area, I bet you we've made a cut. I'm going to widen back out to 30 again. Oops, I ticked where I shouldn't have ticked. Okay, so we're going to now step back down to 663 for a moment. I'm actually going to see what that number was again. 663 is 208. And we will Turn Google Overlay back on so we're heading in the right direction. Then we got another marker, and we're going to tick back up to 665. You can make some notes on a piece of paper so you don't have to constantly go back and see what your number is. Just to make it easier, scribble down a little, jot down a note. Got an underpass under US Highway 41. This is sort of a marshy bottom land area, and this control point on the railroad is known as Lookout. And Lookout is a point where there was a double track bridge, but at the time they built Wauhatchie Yard, they abandoned the second track from this point around some distance to Wildwood and made that single track because they no longer needed a double track situation here. But just recently in 2019 and 2020, they've actually come and put a good portion of that track back in as the operational needs of the railroad have changed. So now we have a creek. And I'm actually just going to stop at the edge of what would be the abutment for the bridge here, and I'm going to pick it up over here on the other side, same height. You see we're making a nice fill. And then when we actually construct our railroad, we'll have to put a bridge in there because there's a decent sized creek. Continuing on the 665, we're going to go just to the other side of the bridge. And that is an overpass for the Norfolk Southern AGS line, Alabama Great Southern. And we have another marker here where we're going to change our elevation. This time we're going up to 666 feet. Which is 202.99. Now, if we go back, I believe we've already starting to climb here to 667. So we'll go to 203.30. Let's go back and look at Google Earth again just for the fun of it. Readjust to where we were located. Let's get some elevations here. Actually, I think I can step that up a little bit. So we start here. Where I had my pen, we were at 665, 666, and by the time you reach the end of the curve, we're actually up to 671. sort of peaks and then you start down. I'm going to call that peak somewhere in the vicinity of 669 as opposed to 670, just to make it a little more gentle grade. Let's change that. That's, oops, keep forgetting you've got to retype that every time. 669 becomes 203.91. Let's go back into the program and we'll change that up again. 203.91. Okay, so we're going to adjust this a little bit. Now I know this road is actually about the same height as the railroad around there, so I'm going to go ahead and lower that down a little bit. That makes things look a little more uniform. Now we look back, you see we've got a cut back here, which is actually where a bridge would be for the Norfolk Southern Railroad. And then we have fill. Let's take off Google Overlay. We have fill now where the railroad would come up to Lookout Creek. And then we enter a cut where Highway 41 goes over. And we're passing through some area. Now look at the difference in the height where I placed my markers earlier. Some areas where there are some cuts. And we travel back around the front of the mountain into the wide area where the railroad grade and the interstate lay between the bottom of the mountain and the river. And we wind back up here to our starting point. You can see the front of the mountain there. We've created quite an abrupt change. That's all a stone face. And as we go along, we will get some scenery on that. I'm going to wind this one up for tonight. And we will continue again and we'll actually lay some track. So hang in there with me. I know this seems long and tedious, but this is what you kind of got to go through. But we now have a nice grade all along the front of the mountain there where we can come and quickly get some track laid and set the gradients on it and make it look like something. Thank you for joining me. Keep having fun. Good day.